It was the crisis that wasn't. A scenario so plausible, so perfectly aligned with years of political drama, that its failure to materialize is more revealing than if it had. In early 2026, analysts, pundits, and politicians held their breath. Following the US and Israeli strikes on Iran in the summer of 2025, everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The script was already written. Iran, under immense pressure, would lash out, blockading the world's most critical oil choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. Global energy markets would spiral into chaos, and a furious President Donald Trump would demand that his NATO allies, the very partners he had spent years berating over money, send their warships to fix his problem. Everyone thought they knew what would happen next. The allies, tired of the transactional threats and public insults, would refuse. They would, in the parlance of the moment, laugh in his face. It would be the spectacular backfire of a foreign policy doctrine built on intimidation, leaving an American president utterly isolated on the world stage, panicking as his America First policy devolved into America alone. That was the story everyone was prepared to tell. A story of hubris and consequence, the culmination of a decade of transatlantic tension. But it's not what happened. The predicted crisis did escalate on February 28, 2026, when the US and Israel launched a new, larger wave of military operations against Iran. The strikes were devastating, and in the critical weeks that followed, as the world teetered on the brink, Trump's allies didn't laugh. They didn't abandon him. The grand, humiliating rejection that seemed so inevitable simply never came. This isn't the story of how Donald Trump's tough guy act failed. This is the far more complex and surprising story of why, at the moment of maximum crisis, it seemingly didn't. To understand what really happened in March of 2026, we first have to understand the crisis that everyone expected, and why they were so certain it would end in disaster. Imagine waking up to this news. Overnight, the global economy has been put on life support. The price of oil hasn't just risen, it's tripled. In Asia and Europe, an energy crisis more severe than anything seen in the 1970s has begun. The cause is a single, decisive act of geopolitical blackmail. Iran, in a desperate gamble, has shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow artery through which 20% of the world's oil flows. Tankers are at a standstill, global markets are in freefall, and from the White House comes a roar of fury, a demand, not a request, for a grand armada of NATO warships to break the blockade. Now imagine the response from Europe. A deafening silence, punctuated by polite but firm refusals. German officials cite constitutional limits. The French president speaks of strategic autonomy. An EU foreign policy chief declares there is simply no appetite for America's war. This was the nightmare scenario, the predicted, logical and terrifying conclusion to years of fraying alliances. It was the story of Trump demanding help and his allies turning their backs. The expected collapse of a system built on trust, replaced by one driven by pressure and resentment. That expectation didn't come from nowhere. It was the direct result of years of tension. From the beginning, Trump viewed NATO not as a shared security pact, but as a financial imbalance. The 2% defense spending target became his central argument. Less a goal, more a bill he believed Europe refused to pay. His presidency was marked by public criticism of allies, especially Germany, and repeated questioning of NATO's core principle, collective defense. He introduced uncertainty where alliances depend on certainty. Added to that were tariffs on European industries and public confrontations with Allied leaders, reinforcing the idea that US policy had shifted from cooperation to transaction. So when tensions with Iran escalated, analysts believed the breaking point had arrived. The logic was simple. If Europe depended more on Middle Eastern oil than the US, then Trump could leverage that dependency. He could demand action. And Europe, wary of being dragged into another conflict, would refuse. But reality took a different turn. On February 28, 2026, a large-scale escalation unfolded. The US and Israel launched widespread strikes across Iran. This was not a limited action, it was a significant military campaign. Iran responded quickly, targeting US bases across the region. The feared conflict had begun, but not in the gradual economic way many expected. It was immediate and direct. The Strait of Hormuz became a flashpoint, with disruptions to shipping driving oil prices upward. But instead of a diplomatic collapse, something more complicated emerged. Trump publicly criticized NATO for not joining the fight, calling their stance disappointing. Yet at the same time, he acknowledged that allies supported the decision itself. They agreed with the objective, but chose not to participate militarily. This created a new dynamic. Not rejection, not unity, but something in between. Political backing without military involvement. The groundwork for this response had been laid earlier. In early 2026, discussions within NATO focused heavily on defense spending. Trump pushed for a dramatic increase, from 2% to 5% of GDP. Surprisingly, many allies signaled willingness to move in that direction. For Trump, this was validation. For European leaders, it was strategy. By addressing his central demand, they reduced pressure on other fronts. It was a calculated move, meeting financial expectations to maintain broader stability. At the same time, the nature of the threat mattered. A nuclear-capable Iran was not just a US concern, it affected European security as well. Even if methods were debated, the underlying objective had shared support. There was also a practical reality. Europe's military capacity was still developing. Despite discussions of greater independence, many countries remained reliant on US support for large-scale operations. Avoiding direct involvement wasn't just political, it was logistical. Leadership within NATO also played a role. Diplomatic engagement shifted tone. Instead of confrontation, there was a greater emphasis on alignment, reassurance, and managing differences quietly rather than publicly. In the end, the expected collapse didn't happen. The alliance adapted. The story wasn't one of panic or failure. It became a story of adjustment under pressure. The alliance didn't fracture, it recalibrated. This new version of cooperation looks different. It's less about idealism and more about practical balance, shared interests, managed disagreements, and negotiated commitments. The events of 2026 didn't provide a final answer about the future of alliances, but they did show that even under strain, systems can evolve rather than break. And that raises a bigger question. In a world where alliances are increasingly shaped by negotiation instead of assumption, what happens when the next crisis can't be managed through compromise? That's the question still waiting to be answered.